Oliver Bearman survived a 50G impact at Suzuka and walked away with nothing more than a bruised knee. That fact alone should terrify everyone in Formula 1. What if the most dangerous thing on the 2026 grid isn't a corner, a rival, or a tire, but the algorithm deciding when a car gets to go fast? Leaked telemetry from Japan just exposed the exact moment Bearman's car closed a 138 kilometers per hour speed gap in under 2 seconds. The data tells a completely different story, and that is where this story gets complicated. Under the 2026 bodywork lies a revolution that changed everything. Electrical output tripled to 350 kilowatts, while combustion power dropped to around 400 kilowatts, creating a near 50-50 split for the first time in the sport's history. Drivers now have a boost button that floods the rear axle with power, a feature they jokingly call mushroom mode. But jokes stopped when Bearman pressed that button behind Franco Colapinto and physics took over. Max Verstappen called the system anti-driving, and his words carry weight because the data backs them up. What no broadcast covered is the truth. Machine learning algorithms underneath control speed deployment, not the driver's right foot. This video will reveal the one design choice that turned a racing innovation into a safety time bomb. The fix could reshape the entire championship, but only if the sport acts before the next street circuit, because Suzuka had gravel and runoff to absorb that impact. Baku has concrete walls, Singapore has barriers with barely any gap, Las Vegas runs along public roads with almost no escape. And if this same closing speed happens where the wall is 2 meters from the racing line, the outcome changes completely. This is the part that changes everything, and what comes next explains exactly how the algorithm took control. Bearman noticed something wrong at the Chinese Grand Prix that should have set off alarm bells. He drove a perfect lap through the fastest corners, yet ended up 2/10 slower overall. The car had punished him for pushing harder. What the paddock is not talking about is why a racing car would penalize a driver for going faster. The answer lies in the machine learning algorithms that now control energy deployment. These systems start every lap with a full battery target and force harvesting when drivers deviate from the plan, and that creates a trap no driver saw coming. The 2026 rules changed the power balance completely. Electrical output now sits at 350 kilowatts, while combustion power dropped to around 400 kilowatts. That near equal split means the electric motor can make or break a lap, but the algorithm does not care about driver instinct. If a driver burns more energy than expected through corners, the system switches to harvesting mode earlier on the next straight. McLaren warned about this in February testing, saying closing speed gaps were dangerous. Their warning was proven right in Japan. This is the part that changes everything. The boost button was meant to give drivers control. Instead, it became a trigger that overrides the algorithm's timing at the worst possible moments. When Bearman pressed it behind Colapinto, the system flooded his drivetrain with peak power while the car ahead sat on combustion alone. The result was a closing speed that belongs on a highway, not between two Formula 1 cars. But there was another layer to this crash that no one saw, a missing signal that should have warned Bearman about the danger ahead. And that is exactly what the next section reveals. Franco Colapinto's rear warning lights were not flashing as Bearman closed in at Suzuka. That missing signal changed everything. The rules say those lights must activate when a car harvests energy, telling the driver behind that slower speed is coming. But Colapinto's Alpine was not harvesting. It was not deploying either. The motor generator unit sat in a neutral state, hidden in its slowness. What no broadcast covered is this. A car can lose massive speed without triggering any visual warning, and that creates a blind spot no driver can react to in time. Oscar Piastri saw the same thing from further up the track. He noted there was no flashing light on the Alpine, and the car did not even seem to be super clipping. That polite observation masks a serious design gap. Colapinto's speed dropped to 170 kilometers per hour in 4th gear, while Bearman approached at 308 kilometers per hour in 7th. The rules only require lights during active harvesting, not when the MGU simply stops pushing power. Inside the Alpine garage, engineers knew their energy cutoff strategy created this blind spot, but no one connected it to safety until lap 21. Damon Hill compared this sudden slowing to brake testing on the fastest parts of a circuit. This is the part that changes everything. If a warning light does not flash when a car loses 138 kilometers per hour of potential speed, how many near misses have already happened off camera? Bearman had no visual cue that the car ahead had dropped to a pace better suited to a feeder series qualifying run. By the time his eyes registered the danger, physics had already made the choice. The next section breaks down the exact moment reaction time became irrelevant, and why the numbers show avoidance was impossible. The telemetry from lap 21 at Suzuka shows Bearman's car closing the gap at 69 kilometers per hour per second. That number alone explains why avoidance was impossible. Human reaction time sits around 0.3 seconds, but the closing speed demanded a decision in half that time. What the data actually shows is the exact frame where physics overruled instinct. Bearman saw the gap, pressed boost, and then the world changed faster than his brain could process. But the numbers only tell half the story. At 308 kilometers per hour in 7th gear, Bearman had roughly 0.4 seconds from visual recognition to impact. That is below the minimum needed for evasive steering input. The crash recorded 50 G of lateral load, a figure that sits between Max Verstappen's 51 G Silverstone impact and Carlos Sainz's 46 giant barrel roll in Russia. The survival cell and halo performed exactly as designed. Bearman walked away with a bruised knee, but the fact he survived does not fix the system that created the danger. This is the part that changes everything. Suzuka forgave Bearman because it has gravel traps and runoff area designed to absorb energy over distance. But the next section reveals something even more unsettling. All the drivers and teams had warned about these closing speeds months before Japan. The GPDA raised the issue in Friday briefings. McLaren spoke out during preseason testing, and the response from the governing body was not what anyone expected. What comes next explains why the warning was ignored. The Grand Prix Drivers Association warned the FIA about these closing speeds during the Friday briefing before the Japanese Grand Prix. McLaren had flagged the same danger publicly during February testing, saying the sport should not wait for a crash before acting. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. Those warnings came months before Suzuka, and they fell on deaf ears. The governing body's response was not an urgent safety fix. It was a small adjustment for qualifying only, and that decision left the race settings fully untouched. What came next was entirely predictable. The FIA cut the peak energy recharge limit for qualifying at Suzuka from 9 megajoules to 8 megajoules. A real change, yes, but one that only applied to Saturday. Racing would continue under the same rules that created the danger. Fernando Alonso called the 2026 Formula the Battery World Championship, waving off the overtaking as random rather than skilled. Drivers were vocal that the problem was not only qualifying, it was also racing. Their anger reached every remaining circuit on the calendar, but the real story was never about the lap time. Later in the same race, George Russell slowed through the same stretch, but Charles Leclerc got past safely. The difference was simple. Russell held his line and his rear harvest lights were flashing, giving the visual warning that Colapinto's car had lacked. Same track, same speed gap, different outcome. Only because of a flashing light. This proves the fix is possible, so why was it not in place before Bearman's crash? The answer lies in a battle no fan sees, and that is exactly what the next section reveals. Audi and Honda entered Formula 1, betting on the 2026 power unit rules. Now those same rules face scrutiny after Suzuka. The biggest proposed fix would cut peak motor generator unit output from 350 kilowatts to as low as 200 kilowatts. That change would narrow dangerous speed gaps, but it would also weaken the deals that brought new manufacturers into the sport. What the data actually shows is this: teams that spent hundreds of millions on machine learning deployment algorithms gained the most from current complexity. Asking them to simplify means asking them to surrender a hard-earned edge. McLaren prefers a different solution: raise the super clipping recovery threshold to match the full 350 kilowatts output. This would let cars harvest faster and cut the extreme drain cycles that create massive speed differentials. Other ideas include dropping the per lap energy harvest limit from 9 megajoules to 6 megajoules, or raising fuel flow limits to give the combustion engine more punch. But every fix needs agreement from teams whose grid positions depend on the current setup. This is the part that changes everything. The championship could be reshuffled by a mid-season rule change, making resistance to change understandable even when safety is at stake. So the sport stands at a crossroads: fix the system now and risk upsetting the competitive order. Wait for more data and risk another crash at a less forgiving circuit. Bearman survived because Suzuka has runoff, but the next section reveals what happens when that same closing speed meets a street circuit with concrete walls and no escape. The numbers do not lie, and they point to a danger that grows with every race left on the calendar. What comes next explains why time is running out. Baku's castle section has concrete walls just 1.2 meters from the racing line at speeds over 300 kilometers per hour. If Bearman's crash happens there, the barrier design cannot handle a broadside hit at 50 G. Singapore threads between barriers with barely any gap at those speeds. Las Vegas runs along solid walls on public roads with almost no runoff. None of these circuits have the luxury of Suzuka's gravel traps. What the data actually shows is this. Street circuit barriers are built for head-on impacts at much lower speeds, not lateral loads from algorithmic closing speeds. And that changes everything. Charles Leclerc called the energy swings yo-yoing during the race, saying it was not racing. His words carry weight because Mercedes and Ferrari have long advocated for proactive safety measures. The barrier specs tell the same story. Suzuka's runoff absorbs energy over distance. Baku's castle walls do not. Singapore's average gap of 0.8 meters in high-speed sections leaves no margin for error. Las Vegas public road barriers have minimal energy absorption for lateral impacts. This is the part that changes everything. A 50 G broadside hit at any of these circuits would exceed design tolerances. If a title contender crashes at one of these street circuits due to the same system flaw, the championship itself could be decided by regulation failure, not driver skill. The sport has a choice. Act now on the warning lights gap, or wait for a worse outcome. Bearman survived because Suzuka forgave him. The next circuit might not, and that is why the final section reveals the one change that could fix this before it is too late. The core design choice that created this risk was simple: handing speed control to machine learning algorithms without a mandatory visual warning for neutral motor generator states. That single gap turned mushroom mode from a joke into a warning label the sport ignored. Bearman survived because Suzuka has gravel and runoff, not because the system protected him. The data tells a completely different story. His luck is not a safety strategy, and that is why the April meetings matter more than any race result this season. One spec change could fix the warning light gap today. Mandate lights for any MGU state below 90% deploy threshold. That small adjustment would give drivers the visual cue they lacked at Spoon Curve. The FIA has the power to act now, but the real question is whether safety will override competitive complexity. Bearman's bruised knee should be the last warning this sport receives. What comes next must be a decision, not a delay. If the governing body waits for a worse crash to act, the championship itself could be decided by regulation failure, not driver skill. Every fan who loves this sport deserves transparency on the April meeting outcomes, because safety transcends team loyalty. Formula 1 has always danced on the edge of physics, but when the algorithm decides where that edge is, the driver isn't just racing the track, they are racing a system that cannot see them coming.